Well, this morning we're going to finish up our series, Kingdom of God, and we're going to be in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 2. So if you want to go ahead and open there or grab your phones and turn to Daniel chapter 2, that's going to be where we are focusing on. And we're actually going to be focusing on a dream that a king has. Now, when we talk about a dream, I'm not talking about a goal that you set, but an actual literal dream that an ancient king has. And we're going to look at this passage, and then we're going to see what it has to say about the kingdom of God. And so in Daniel chapter 2, you kind of have this situation in which you have King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar is the king of the Babylonian Empire at this particular time. And so when a king is in rule, what he would do a lot of times is he would have these visions or these dreams in which he invited people to come in and interpret what this dream meant for him, or what it meant for the people, or whatever the meaning of the dream would be. So in Daniel chapter 2, you have a situation in which Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he's deeply troubled by this dream. And he's kind of freaking out about what it means. So what he does is he invites all the sorcerers and the magicians and the enchanters and all of these wise men of the empire of Babylon to come and interpret this dream so he knows what in the world it means. But the interesting thing about it is he doesn't tell them the dream that he had. And so you have all of these wise men that have traveled into Babylon to tell and help the king out. And they come to him, and the king says, I want you to interpret this dream. And so they're all saying, okay, tell us the dream. We'll tell you what it means. And the king goes, no, this is not how it's going to work this time. This time around, you're going to tell me the dream that I had. And if you got that part right, then I'll trust your interpretation of that dream. So these guys have this hard task of not only just interpreting the dream, they have to tell him what he dreamed about. And then to make matters worse, he goes, and if you don't tell me the correct dream, then that's it for you. Your life's gone. Like, I will take your life. And so obviously these wise men start freaking out like, well, I have no idea where to begin trying to figure out what dream you had, O king. And so they can't get the answer right. They don't know what's going on. And so the king makes his decree. He's like, okay, then all of the wise men in Babylon, they will die. And so the royal guard starts going out to fulfill the mission of the king to kill the wise men in Babylon. Well, at this particular time, Babylon, when it's in control, it has taken over the southern part of Israel. So this is the last part of the Israel kingdom that stood, and then the Babylonian Empire came in and overtook the southern part of the kingdom of Israel, known as Judah. And when he did, King Nebuchadnezzar would then take some of the brightest and smartest from the peoples that he conquered, and they would then serve in his court. They would serve him. So when the Babylonian king, when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes over Judah, he then withdraws some of the wise men of Israel, some young guys who, in their minds, showed promise. And so these are guys that we know by their original name were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So these are the four guys that the king comes into Israel, or part of the four, or part of the men. These are four that he takes back to the capital city of Babylon, which is Babylon. And they serve under him. And so when they get there, then the king then changes their name to the names that we might be more familiar with if you grew up in church. So Daniel, we kind of remember as Daniel, but he actually changes his name to Belshazzar. And then that changes Hananiah to Shadrach, Mishael to Meshach, and Azariah to Abednego. So those are the names that we might be more familiar with if we grew up in the church. But these are the wise men of Judah. Now, typically when the king would have a dream, these wise men that he would bring in would include these young guys from Judah. But for whatever reason, we aren't told from the text, they are not included when the king brings in all the wise men. So the first time they hear about this king having a dream is when the royal guards come to kill them, because they couldn't tell the king the dream. And so when the royal guard comes in to kill Daniel and his friends, Daniel speaks up and goes, whoa, like what dream are you talking about? Like, I haven't heard anything about this dream that we're supposed to interpret. So he says, if you'll just give me a chance, a moment before the king, like I would love my chance at like trying to interpret this dream before our lives are ended. And so then the royal guard says, well, if you didn't know about it, then you get a chance to kind of hear the dream or hear from the king and try to interpret this dream. So then in Daniel chapter 2, there's something interesting that I want us to see, not because it necessarily plays into the kingdom of God thing that we're going to be talking about this morning, but because it raises a really important life lesson for all of us. And so in Daniel chapter 2, when Daniel gets clearance from the guards to go and talk to Nebuchadnezzar about his dream, in verse 17, it says, then Daniel went to his house, and he made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men in Babylon. And then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision at night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So Daniel immediately, when he hears about this, he intercedes, like, let me try to figure out what's going on. So he immediately runs to his companions and he seeks their help. Like for those of us in here, like when we come upon difficult or hard situations in our lives, the first thing that we need to do is run to those that are around us and say, like, will you enter in and pray for me in the midst of this? And so that's what Daniel does. He goes into a hard situation in which he knows that if he does not get this right, then that's it. That's the end of his life. That's the end of all of his buddies. That's the end of all the wise men. Like, this is it. So it's a high-stakes situation. And he goes to them, and he prays to God, and he seeks mercy, the mercy of God for him to reveal the dream to him. And thankfully, God does. And so then once God reveals the dream to Daniel, right after that, in 20 through 23, you see this praise of Daniel to God for who he is. Like, if just thanking him, if you think about it for a second, sometimes we dissect ourselves from the story. Put yourself in the situation of Daniel. You're praying to the Lord, like, Lord, just tell me what this is so that we don't die. The Lord reveals it. So those next 3 verses is just David, like, just rejoicing. Like, oh man, God, you are good. Like, thank you for doing this for us. Like, you are the God of gods. You are the King of kings. You are the greatest of all. Like, you are everything. And so then he gets the moment to go stand before King Nebuchadnezzar and tell the dream to the king. So again, don't dissect ourselves from the story. Like, you've got to imagine. This is a moment, he's standing before the king, and he's going to tell the dream that the king had. If he's wrong, it's over. If he's right, then he's going to be showered blessings upon him. And so he stands before the king, and this is what Daniel says, that the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed himself, and starting in verse 31. Daniel says, "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and it broke them into pieces. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all together, were broken into pieces, and became like chaff on the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that the trace of them might not be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain, and it filled the whole earth." So he has this dream of this statue, and this statue there is so big and kind of terrifying. It has this head that is of gold. It has a chest and arms of silver. It has the waist and thighs of bronze, and then it has the lower legs made of iron, and then its feet are made of a mixture of iron and clay. And so he has this dream, and so based on that depiction, we kind of get this idea of what this statue might have looked like. We have this gold head, you have the silver chest, you have the bronze waist, the iron legs, and the iron and clay feet. And so this is what most people would say, like if you were to kind of come up with a depiction of what this statue looked like, this is what it would look like. And so in this dream, you have this situation in which the statue is going, but then you have a situation in which a stone is then cast down or thrown down at the statue. And this stone strikes the feet of the statue on the clay and the iron, and it breaks it down. And then all of the statue comes crumbling down, and it gets laid to waste like dust, or Daniel would say like chaff. So chaff is the outer shells of wheat or rice. When you would collect it, then you would beat the wheat literally on the floor to break away the heads of the wheat away from the shell of the wheat. And so that's the chaff. And then it's so light, wind could carry it wherever it wanted to. So the idea that Daniel says here is there's this stone that is cast down, it hits the feet, and then it completely destroys this statue. Where it is all blown away, there is absolutely nothing left. And then this stone becomes a mountain, and it grows, and it fills the whole earth. And so this is a very strange dream that the king has. And again, at this point of the story, Daniel doesn't even know if that's the right one outside of the faith that he has that God told him the right one. Right? Like at this moment, he is uttering this dream, saying like, this is what your dream was. Like, here it is, not really knowing for sure from the mouth of the king whether this was the right dream. Now, we know on in Daniel chapter 2 that this is the dream that the king had. But in that moment, the anticipation of what's going on, And then Daniel begins to interpret the dream. But before we get to the interpretation, there's one observation I think we should make, is the difference between the statue and the stone. Now, the statue, like every other statue that we've ever known in our entire lifetimes, a statue is built by human hands, right? Like you just don't go out into the woods and see a statue built and somebody's like, nobody built it. It just showed up here one day. No, like we understand every statue is built by human hands. So there's a statue in the dream which says that there's a statue that's been built by human hands, but yet the stone, Daniel specifically says, is not like any human has made this. So there's a difference that Daniel is contrasting that within this dream that plays an important role. There's a statue that's created by human hands, and then there's a stone that is not created by human hands. But then Daniel goes on, after he tells the dream of the king of the dream, he then interprets it. So in Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 36, this is what Daniel says that the dream means. This was the dream. Now we will tell you, the king, its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. And so Daniel enters in and says, okay, let's interpret this dream. The head of gold, that is you, king. You are the king of kings. You are the king of Babylon. You are represented by the head of gold. Now, what's interesting is he gives him this phrase, king of kings, and then he goes on and lays on this praise that you have been given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory. Like if we have grown up in the church at all of those phrases are very familiar to us. When we would say king of kings, and we would talk about the king of kings, we're talking about God himself. But here, Daniel, who is a God follower, says, you, O king, are the king of kings. So what is Daniel doing ascribing this lofty title to an earthly king? Why is he doing that? Well, remember that he is under the subjugation of this king. So he's telling the king, like, you are a great king. And at this particular time, the kingdom of Babylon is the greatest kingdom on the earth. And so he looks and he says, king, you are the king of kings. There is no one like you. All of these kingdoms come and dwell in your presence. All of these peoples come and dwell in your presence. He was like, you are the king of kings. But then Daniel follows it up with a very important statement. He says, you are the king of kings to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom. So he looks at the king and says, yes, you are the greatest King Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king the world has ever known, but someone put you there. You are not the one who established your own throne, but yet, as he said back in his praises of Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, that the God that I serve, Daniel speaking, the God that I serve, he places and removes kings as he sees fit, according to the plan in which he has. So he looks at the king and says, you are the greatest of kings, but you are not God. It's this moment for Nebuchadnezzar for humility to enter into his life. And he kind of looks at him and says, you are the king of kings, but you are simply not God. But you are in the statue, you are this gold head. And so then he continues on interpreting the rest of the dream. Verse 39. And he says, another kingdom inferior to you shall rise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks into pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and the toes, partially of potter's clay and partially of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the mixed iron with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with the soft clay, so they will mix one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And so then, after he tells Nebuchadnezzar, you are represented by the head of gold. Then he said, there's going to be two kingdoms that come after you. One kingdom of silver, one kingdom of bronze. And both of these kingdoms are going to be inferior to your kingdom. And so he's trying to let the king know, like, there's going to be two specific kingdoms. So we know that if the first head, the gold head, represents one specific kingdom, then these other materials evidently represent different kingdoms that are going to come after the Babylonian Empire. And so then he says there will be two that rise up that are inferior, but he kind of brushes over those. If you look, there's only like one sentence that's spent on these two kingdoms. There's going to be two kingdoms that come, you're going to be greater than them. But then he spends a immense amount of time talking about the kingdom that would come after that, the kingdom of iron. The kingdom of iron that would crush all. But then the kingdom of iron is also unexpectedly fragile. It's unexpectedly brittle, that it will be able to be broken apart rather easily. And so throughout history, people have been baffled over what these kingdoms are. It's kind of like what wells up within us when we see that the head of the statue is Babylon, and then we know that it represents other kingdoms. It begins to create speculation in us, like, well, who is the silver kingdom and who is the bronze kingdom? Well, who's the iron kingdom? Who's the iron and clay kingdom? Like, who are these? How do these line up? And there's been a ton of speculation over the years. A ton of speculation. You could open up 3 different books that talk about Daniel chapter 2 and probably get 3 different interpretations of what the statue means in Daniel chapter 2 and what kingdom is represented by which material. But historically, the oldest interpretation of how these kingdoms line up like this image that we see here. The gold obviously represents Babylon. That's what we're told within the text. The silver would be lined up with the Medo-Persian Empire that would come after this. So in Daniel chapter 9, we see the rise of Cyrus and Darius. That would be the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. And then after that, you have the rise of the Bronze Kingdom, or that is represented by the Greek Empire. And then the last kingdom that's represented, you have the iron of the Roman Empire. So it crushed everything it came in contact with. But eventually the Roman Empire splits. Right? We see this. There's an Eastern Roman Empire and a Western Roman Empire. Most people would say that that's represented by the clay and the iron, because then that empire is then crushed, toppled, and that's the end of it. Right? And so historically, that is how these kingdoms would line up. But there's a lot of speculation over this because it is not directly told us in the text that this is who it is. The only one we know for sure is Babylon. That's the only one we know. The rest of them is all speculation, educated guesses, what we see, what we think. Like, that is kind of the interpretation of that. And the reason for that is because the goal of this is not about what specific kingdoms are coming. It's simply to let Nebuchadnezzar know that there will be kingdoms that rise and there will be kingdoms that fall. That is the whole point of this dream. It's not for Nebuchadnezzar to understand exactly what kingdoms are going to come. Because if you think about it, if Nebuchadnezzar is the king of the most powerful kingdom at this particular time, and he knows the Medo-Persian Empire is going to come along, don't you think he would want to go from Daniel, who is the leader of the Medo-Persian Empire? Who do we need to take out right now so my kingdom can keep going on? Who do I need to take out? But he doesn't ask that. Never once does Nebuchadnezzar actually ask for the identity of those other kingdoms. And Daniel doesn't even reveal that within the dream. So obviously within the scheme of God, the point of the dream is not for him to know which kingdoms are coming. Now it helps us because we're inquisitive minds, and for modern readers, like, we want to know, and we can kind of lay those things out and we can see them. But ultimately the dream of the goal for Daniel and for Nebuchadnezzar at this time is not for him to know exactly what kingdoms are going to come, just to know that kingdoms are going to come and kingdoms are going to fall. And then Daniel continues on with the dream to talk about the stone. So he's covered the statue, and then in verse 44 through 45, he begins talking about the stone. And in those days, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break into pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke into pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So then Daniel says that you have this statue, the stone that comes will be a kingdom that is established by God himself. It will crush the feet of those kingdoms. The statue will fall, but yet this stone that crushes the iron and the clay that causes this statue to fall down, then it will begin a kingdom that will grow throughout the earth and will grow into a great mountain. So why most scholars, why they would line it up the way that they do with the Medo-Persian, the Greek, and the Roman Empire, is because of the phrase in verse 44, in those days the kings of the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, a kingdom that shall not be left to another people. They would say that within the Roman Empire, that's when the kingdom of God began, right? And so there's this kingdom, this stone that was thrown at the statue that crushed, that caused all these other kingdoms to fall. And this is a kingdom that will grow throughout the earth into a strong mountain. Now, a lot of times the mountain of God is used kind of metaphorically throughout various texts. But in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, we see that when the mountain of God is talked about, it's talking about the rule and the command of God. And so it is literally saying within this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, that there's this kingdom that's going to come, and it's going to smash the feet of all earthly kingdoms. All earthly kingdoms will bow down to this God-established kingdom, and this kingdom will establish the rule of God across the world. That every nation, tribe, tongue, people group will come and be a part of this kingdom. And that it will continue to grow and grow and grow. And so the idea that Daniel is trying to get Nebuchadnezzar to understand is that your kingdom will fall, and this kingdom is going to fall, and this kingdom is going to fall, but there's going to be one that is not like human hands. Remember the observation? This is a stone unlike that's cut from human hands. It's not like that. It's not like the statue. This is completely otherworldly, and it will be established by God himself. It is the kingdom of God, and this kingdom will never stop. It will never fail. It will continue on. So no matter what takes place in this world, the kingdom of God will remain. So he's trying to get Nebuchadnezzar to understand that as great as your kingdom is, King, O King of Kings, it's going to fall. And then after that's going to fall. And then that's going to fall. And then that's going to fall. And that's going to fall. And this kingdom is going to fall. But the kingdom of God, it will last forever. It will never be toppled. And it will grow from a stone into a great mountain that will establish God's rule throughout this world. So while the kingdoms of this world may change, the kingdom of God will never change. The king who sits on the throne of that kingdom will never be overthrown. He will always sit on his throne. And so for us, as we are on the cusp of another election, 2 days off from determining who are going to be the political leaders of our country, we have to be reminded that we cannot get worried over the future of our country to the point where it just paralyzes us. Because, I mean, let's be honest. We love our country. We truly do believe it's the best country in the world and the world has ever seen. Like, we truly believe that. But yet, at the same time, it is still a kingdom. Just like the Medo-Persian Empire, just like the Roman Empire, like it is still a kingdom built and established by man. And most likely, just like with every other kingdom that has ever existed and that ever will exist, this kingdom will fall. And that's not for us to freak out. Or that's not for me to be like, and this is why you must vote for this person. Like, that's not the idea behind it. But it's for us to put in perspective what's taking place within our world. Because sometimes we can get so fixated on what's just taking place today or tomorrow or right around us or within our country. We can forget the grand scheme or the eternal scheme of God in the midst of this. And so while we may be worried about what's taking place in a few days, we've got to remember that this kingdom is going to fall. Not to freak out, but to put it in perspective. There's only one kingdom that was established by Jesus in the first century, and that kingdom will never fail. But all other kingdoms will come. All other kingdoms will go. This is why we can't put all of our hope and our energy and our focus into a kingdom made by man. We can't ultimately put our hope and our energy and our focus in America. I know it sounds really weird to say, especially like 2 days before election, and I'm by no means saying that we don't participate in the election process. Like, that is a civic duty that we have. But what I'm saying is we can't pull all of our energy and our focus and our hope into that, because it is a kingdom established by men that will fall. And when it falls, if we put everything we've got into it, then when it falls, we will be left standing going, what's going on? Where did I miss it? Why is this taking place? Because King Nebuchadnezzar is sitting there going, my kingdom is the best kingdom that's ever been. And then Daniel comes in and says, no, your kingdom's going to fall. Your kingdom's going to be crushed. And so he's trying to tell us that our ultimate hope and our energy and our focus does not rely in the kingdoms of this earth, but the kingdom that is never going to fail. A kingdom that Daniel said it starts out of a stone. Starts out of a stone, or as we talked about last week, it starts out as a mustard seed, the tiniest of mustard seeds, and it would grow into the great mustard tree. Or it would be like leaven that permeates all of dough. It's a kingdom that has an insignificant start with a guy named Jesus who's born in a trough in the middle of a town called Bethlehem that no one knew outside of just being a town called Bethlehem. But yet that is where the kingdom begins. It's an insignificant start, but it grows into a kingdom that includes all people, something that the kingdoms of the world tried to achieve, they couldn't do, but the kingdom of God could do. See, every kingdom that's ever existed, what they try to do is the king establishes and says, I will be the one that rules the world. I will be the one that takes over this people and these people, and I will join them together, and we will be a great kingdom. But no kingdom has ever done that except the kingdom of God. It is only the kingdom of God in which you have people living in America that are in the same kingdom as people living in Russia, and you have the same people living in Chile, and the same people living in Indonesia, who are all a part of one kingdom, because there is one king that we answer to. And he has joined and broken down, as we talked about several weeks ago, the dividing walls of hostility of humanity and brought together one new man. And so there's a kingdom here that was established by Jesus that will never fail and that will outlast every other country that ever, or every other kingdom that ever is established on this earth. And so as we sit in here this morning, knowing that we're a couple of days away from election that could either be good or bad, depending on whether you're on this side or whether you're on this side, or this is the greatest thing that's ever happened to America, or this is the end of America. Whatever takes place on November 3rd, we have to remind ourselves that there's a God in control of it all. That in Daniel chapter 2, when he is praising Jesus, he says, God changes the times and seasons, he removes kings, and he sets up kings. That the world that we live in, is controlled and under the sovereignty and the provision of an all-knowing and an all-good God. So that the kings that rise and the kings that fall, it is under his sovereignty and his provision in which these things take place. That we have to remind ourselves that whether the one we want to get elected is elected or whether the one we don't want to get elected is elected, we have to remind ourselves that that is simply merely a king. That the Senate is not God, that the House is not God, that the Supreme Court is not God. While those things may change, God himself does not. His kingdom does not change. That no matter what takes place in this country, in this world, that there is still a God in control. And we cannot get so arrogant to think as if we are the ones in control. In Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar builds the famous image that leads to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into a furnace to suffer death. Most scholars will tell you in Daniel chapter 3, the image that Nebuchadnezzar commands them to build would have been a replica of the dream he had in Daniel chapter 2. Because what Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do is trying to make this symbol to himself, but then also to this kingdom around him and everyone under his subject, that my kingdom's never going to fail. So while I may have had a dream that my kingdom is going to fall to the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire, Roman Empire, so on and so forth, he's like, no. Let me tell you how great my kingdom is. So he builds a statue to remind himself of the greatness of his kingdom. Because in his arrogance, his kingdom's never going to end. But then we see in Daniel 6, 7, 8, 9, the downfall of Nebuchadnezzar, the downfall of the Babylonian Empire, because it's a reminder. Daniel 2 tried to tell him, you are simply a king. You're a good king. You've done a lot of major things in the world and you've conquered a lot of peoples, but you are simply a king. But there is a king that is coming that will dwarf your power and your ability and your sense of unity across the kingdom, and he will come and he will crush all other kingdoms, and he will establish a kingdom that will never be overthrown. As we talked about last week, the kingdom of God will not stop. No matter who's elected or who is not elected, the kingdom of God will not stop. If you can imagine yourself, if you know someone that lived through World War II, and just the idea that they were living through and thinking like, this has to be the end of it. What can get worse than what we're possibly going through? In the midst of that chaos, we still had a God who was good and sitting on his throne. There's stories upon countless stories of people who were clinging to that truth in the midst of the terrible atrocities of World War II. Why? Because we know that kingdoms come and kingdoms go, but the glory of the Lord remains forever. And so we have to remind ourselves that regardless of what this week holds, or next year, or 2046, or whatever the next year is, that God is the same. It's amazing to me that as we look upon that statue, we see a God who looks at the kingdom of Babylon and tells the king, your kingdom's going to fall. It's the same God who saw the rise and fall of the Medo-Persian Empire, the same God that saw the rise and fall of the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire and the Incan Empire and the Ottoman Empire and all of these empires. It's the same God who looks upon the United States with sovereignty and says, I've seen the rise and I've seen the fall, and the one thing that has remained the same is me. That I've seen it all and I will see it all to the end. That our hope is in the fact that one day Christ returns to this earth. That one day he returns to this earth and everything that we see, including ourselves, are redeemed the way Christ intended it for, or the way God intended it for us to live. The world around us looks like God intended it for us to live. The way we interact with the others, the way God intended us to live. That's what we put our hope in. We put all of our energy on the fact that he's called you and I to be kingdom bearers, that it is our job. It is literally our job as Christ followers to make the world more like the kingdom of God tomorrow than it is today. That is a responsibility that's been laid on your shoulders as a Christ follower. So that's where we put all of our energy. But then we also have to put all of not only our hope and our energy in those things, but we also have to put all of our focus on the fact that it is for God's glory and not our own. It's not for the glory of America. It's not for the glory of Nathan. It's not for the glory of you. It is for glory of God and God alone. Because when things change and things come and things go, we still have a God who is the King, who is the creator of all things. He is the sustainer of all things. He is the God that has been there in the past, the present, and the future, and he is bringing all things under his rule. And so when we gather together like we do every first Sunday of the month to be able to take communion together, we have to remind ourselves that this is a reminder that the kingdom has come, that the kingdom is here, that we're living in the kingdom. If you think about the disciples, the night before, the guy that they believe all of their hope hinges on, the Messiah, the promised one, the one that's going to establish the kingdom of God, right? He is here to do that. The night before, he looks at them and says, I'm going to be crucified, and I'm going to be buried, and I'm going to resurrect again. Their entire world is about to come crashing down around them. And Jesus, right before he does this, says, let's take communion. Let's take the Passover meal. Let's talk about this new meaning that I'm going to give it. Because he knew that in the midst of tumultuous times and times that are changing, we need to be grounded in the fact. We need to be grounded in the fact that the kingdom has come, the kingdom is here, and we are now living in the kingdom.